Alright, I've got the bulletproof vest on again. By the way, I want to mention that Bulletproof Reviews was an idea from a friend and coworker of mine. Um, she gave me the idea once she found out I owned a bulletproof vest. It's like, oh yeah, let's call it Bulletproof Reviews. I decided not to name the whole channel that, but I do it like when I do my long form reviews of bands or movies. So far as the things that I've reviewed on this series, I think there was one video where I didn't wear my bulletproof vest, but these are bulletproof reviews. I believe this is our 10th video of overall for my channel. So I wanted to review the Terminator franchise, which I watched not too long ago. Fairly recently, I rewatched all the movies in the Terminator franchise. So, since I do have a complete view of the franchise, I'm not only going to give my full review, I'm going to follow it up with a ranking. So, let's go here. So, for this franchise, of course, this franchise deals with time travel, and there's a lot of complicated stuff on this in this franchise. And if you guys have watched my other reviews, you know I like to figure out timelines in movie franchises, and boy, this one is complicated. So, by the way, there's just gonna be spoilers here. You know, I do these reviews assuming that most people have seen these classic movies and like these classic movies and just want to hear other people's thoughts and other people's putting together of different things. So, you know, spoilers throughout. So I definitely recommend watching the first two movies. If you haven't already seen them, watch them. The other ones are give and take. Try them one by one. Just go through them in order. You know, if you like the first two, which are must watch in my opinion, then just, you know, try the third one. If that seems okay to you, try the fourth one, you know, and so on. Okay. So, Terminator. Again, complicated stuff whenever you're dealing with time travel, but basically this first movie presents a unchangeable loop in for time travel. The idea being that what happens in, I believe it's 2029, which at the time of the filming this video is 2023, so we're not very many years away from the dystopian future depicted briefly in this. It's mostly depicted in Kyle Reese's mind when he is remembering what for him is his past, but for everyone else in the movie would be their future. And would be the future of the movie, since the movie itself really takes place in 1984, the year of the movie's release. What Kyle Reese is remembering thinks that for everyone else hasn't happened yet, but he remembers what happened to him when he was younger, because he was younger in the future than he is now in the past. But that's one of the dilemmas created with time travel, of traveling to the past, is that you are going to be older in the past than you were in from what was your present, or now has become the future. but since this presents time travel as unchangeable, 1984 was always 1984, and 2029 is always 2029. It just happens that way. It's kind of interesting. It makes you wonder why they built the time machine in the first place. Um, I guess, the old line from Jurassic Park is they were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think whether or not they should, right? Jurassic Park. So, um, but, it is also possible that the machines who built the time travel machine knew and understood enough about the time continuum to understand how to build a machine that would manipulate time to make time travel possible. At least time travel to the past. We've never seen time travel to the future. I guess we did in some of the later installments. I think, yeah, we do finally get time travel to the future, but mostly the franchise deals with time travel to the past. So it's possible that they weren't 100% sure exactly what time travel would do or how it would affect anything. There might have been theories, but manipulating the time continuum and actually being able to predict exactly the outcome of manipulating the time continuum are two different things. And when we take the first movie, it's in its entirety, with the rest of the franchise, it does seem like actually time is not fixed. That you have to have some sort of explanation of some sort of unfixed time because the events of particular periods of time do change, which means that you either are able to change time through time travel, through traveling through the past, so any particular time is not set but is changeable, or you have to believe that the different things that change during different movies are actually alternate timelines, where each time maybe a person travels back through time, another alternate timeline is established and created, and so the time is not completely unchangeable. At least there are several different timelines, so it seems like maybe each individual timeline is unchangeable and set in what it is, but it seems to be affected by other timelines. It's really complicated once you take the sequels into account. So yeah, I had to take off my bulletproof vest there. Sorry about um, changing up the gimmick a little bit. I didn't want to wear the bulletproof vest through this entire review. It's a little uncomfortable at times, Let's keep going here. So, the first movie is a masterpiece. Now I talked about the time elements. It's closed loop. I mean, there is a looping effect going on because we do have events in the future impacting events from the past. So that is a looping event going on there. Because the whole reason Kyle Reese and the Terminator are in 1984 is because of a time machine that wasn't invented until decades later or whatever, and they travel back from the year 2029. So the whole reason they're in 1984 is related to time travel. Without the time machine, they wouldn't be there. So that makes it complicated. So there is a looping effect as far as cause and effect is concerned. However, it does seem like the intent of the original movie when it was first made, throughout numerous things that go forth, is it's presenting a version of time travel where it is not possible to change anything. Like it really seems like everything happens exactly the way it's supposed to happen for everything else to happen. Um, it seems like Kyle Reese was always in 1984. The Terminator was always in 1984. Kyle Reese, spoiler, of course, is always John's father. Um, you know that seems to be the way it's presented. That the especially if you there's a deleted scene in the first movie where it indicates that the 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 company finding the Terminator, uh, the remains of the Terminator robotic thing that Sarah crushes at the end of the movie, in the hydraulic press, that them finding that is what leads to the creation of the Terminator itself. So the Terminator is kind of responsible for all the stuff that happens afterwards, the war that breaks out between the humans and the machines and all of that. Kind of it creates its own self in a sense, because it's the remains of the Terminator in the computer chip that they find in his head that leads to the development of the technology. That's not just in the second movie, although it is a big feature of the second movie, but it's also in some of the deleted scenes of the first movie. In fact, a deleted scene, by the way, it didn't just happen by accident that they happened to end up in the factory that belonged to the factory that belonged to the company that would eventually create the Terminators. It didn't happen that way by accident. According to the deleted scenes of the first movie, they went there on purpose because one of their plans was to blow up this machine factory that may help prevent the creation of the Terminators in the first place, which of course was expanded on in to stop Judgment Day from happening, is expanded on in the second movie. That's basically the whole plot of the second movie. So it's kind of interesting and good, I guess, that those scenes and all that explanation is missing from the first movie. You don't really see that if you don't watch the deleted scenes. So it kind of feels like they just kind of randomly end up there, but they don't just randomly end up there. They were headed that direction in the first place. So, yeah, it's very looped. It's the Terminator and Kyle Reese that lead to the creation of John Connor in the Terminators, and the movie is very well thought out. It's everything is set up, like, even if you don't catch how this particular thing or that particular thing happens, if you think you can find plot holes, I just ask you to keep your plot hole in mind and rewatch the movie over again, because somewhere in the movie that so-called plot hole is probably answered somewhere in the movie, because the movie is so well done that I don't think I can find any plot holes in it, really. Yes, it relies on a science fiction gimmick. It relies on the idea that time travel is possible. It relies on a particular kind of time travel theory, a theory about how time travel would work if it worked at all. But I think it's very well done. I mean, there's questions in the movie like, why didn't you bring back a gun from the future, a more powerful gun, or a ray gun or something? The psychologist says that mockingly. What? Where's the ray guns? You're from the future. Where's the ray guns? Or something. And it's like, only living tissue can come back through the portal. That's why they had to come naked. So that becomes a thing in the first movie that's followed up in the other movies. Although in the other movies it definitely makes less sense, because how are the liquid Terminators naked? I mean, they're supposed to be liquid metal Terminators, and we even see them have weaknesses to magnets in some of the movies, like Terminator 3 and Terminator Genesis. I think both expose weakness to magnets. So, particularly with the exposed metal Terminators. So, just because they're making their liquid metal parts look like human skin, is that enough to fool the time machine into actually thinking that it's real living tissue? How exactly do they generate something close enough to real living tissue that they can go through the time machine, when the first movie clearly established the reason they don't just send weapons back and bombs or this or that with the Terminator, to complete his mission, or with Kyle Reese for that matter, is because only living tissue can go through. So you can only send a being through. The only way the robot Terminator thing gets through is because it's a cyborg. It's the robot endoskeleton covered with living tissue. It's also a question of how does it sustain that living tissue? Do Terminators have hearts somewhere in their endoskeleton that we've just never seen before? How does it keep its blood? And because you see it bleed, you see it, even in the first movie he says it has bad breath. Stuff like that. So how do they sustain the living tissue on the outside of the Terminator? That's an interesting question to ask. We know that the skeleton is a metal skeleton underneath, but how does the cyborg, the mixture of living tissue and robotic and the brain, how does all that function? It's really interesting to ask some of these questions. I do think, on some level, some of these things do make the movies fall apart. But, with the liquid metal Terminator thing, that's with the sequels, not with the original. The original, the only real question is, how do you sustain the living tissue? Are there some human organs inside the Terminator that sustain the living tissue, or is it just skin and blood and muscle on the outside of the skeleton? And how do you sustain that without a heart? I know in part 3 there's a power cell that's nuclear. This is kind of a contradiction because it seems like a nuclear power cell should have caused major explosions in the first 2 movies. When the Terminators are eventually destroyed, they should be major explosions, but we see that in the 3rd movie. That doesn't really add up or make sense, because we do see one of the nuclear power, I think two of the nuclear power cells explode by the end of the movie. Hit Arnold's primary one and then his backup one. That doesn't seem to really jive with what we saw in the first 2 movies or what we see in the later movies. And also, was the liquid metal Terminator of the 3rd movie powered by a nuclear cell? If so, when did hers explode? I guess it exploded at the same time Arnold sucked his in her mouth and made that one explode, so I guess 2 of them exploded at the same time. I don't know. The questions come up, I think, more and more as you get into the sequels, exactly what, how this would work on a practical level if this were a real life thing. But I think the first movie holds up really well. Again, the only major question I have is, how does the living tissue sustain? Other than that, as far as, because that's something that's never addressed in the movie, and with good reason. If you don't have an answer to the question, don't address it in a movie. Don't bring it to the audience's attention if you're a filmmaker, unless you're going to answer the question, or at least you provide some plausible answers or plausible theories. Don't otherwise just ignore it completely and just don't ask the question. Little filmmaking tip there. And that's what they do, is any question they don't want to answer in this movie, they ignore. How does the time machine work? Don't know. It was created by the machines. It was created by the artificial intelligence, the AI that took over the world, the war between the humans and the machines. But it does provide answers to other questions, like why not bring back weapons from the future? Well, only living tissue can go through. So is the living tissue of the human and the living tissue of the cyborg. I guess it's so covered. The cyborg is so covered in the living tissue that the time machine doesn't. It causes no interference with the endoskeleton underneath, the metal endoskeleton underneath. So it's kind of it's doing all that. I think it's such a well put together movie. It really plays out like a horror movie. The first Terminator is really a horror movie. It's the Arnold in the first movie, classically played the T-800 Model 101, I think it's called, or something like that. In that first movie, he is, he's a robot. He's kind of is meant as an infiltration device, but he, while can blend in maybe looking human, he is not well adapted to humans. And that's something that develops as the series goes on. It seems like every series, when they introduce new Terminators, that they are more adapted to human behavior and that they can blend in better psychologically and socially and better suited for infiltration missions. Other than just looking human on the outside, they know how to act human a little bit more. And that's something that seems to, like every model they build with each movie, gets a little better at pretending to be human, if you will. In the first movie, he's very robotic, and he is kind of like if a robot or a machine in some way were trying to imitate a human with very early, like, AI type of software, a very AI mindset of trying to imitate human behavior. And it gets more advanced as the movies go on. But what I brought up about being a horror movie is that he reminds me so much of a Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees, in that, those characters seem less human. They just seem like killing machines. They almost never talk in any of the franchise movies for either character, Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees. Almost never talks. I think the only movie where Jason really talks, he does in part 9, I guess, in a movie where he's body hopping from body to body. He also does a little bit in part 8. I think there are some scenes where he talks briefly. He says "mommy." Of course, in the first movie, you hear him saying "mommy, mommy," but that's in Pamela Voorhees' mind. I'm getting off on the Friday the 13th franchise, but it's similar in the Halloween franchise, where you almost never see Michael talk. In fact, I think the only 2 movies in the Halloween franchise where Michael talks is Rob Zombie's Halloween 1, Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, and even in Rob Zombie's Halloween 1, it's only the child version of Michael Myers that talks. The adult version never talks. And then in part two, I think it's only in one cut. I forget whether it's the theatrical cut or the director's cut. But like adult Michael Myers says one word. Um, but yeah, so that's, but the Terminator can talk. But I'm just talking about how those characters don't talk basically as examples of how they seem less human. Like they're almost acting like killing machines. Of course, in this movie, in Terminator, it literally is a killing machine. That's what its mission is. It can talk and does talk when it needs to, um, but it will kill anyone in its way. In the first movie, I do think the movie makes sense if you watch it. The first movie, it's like, why doesn't he kill those guys immediately? Why does he ask for their clothing first when the Terminator first shows up? And it's like, well, he doesn't want to get blood all over them. I think is the answer to that. If they would just give him the clothing that he needs to wear, and that clothing doesn't have any blood on it, um, he um, would probably just let them go because his mission is to kill particular people. He's not just killing anyone and everyone that he comes across. He has a mission to kill particular people. But in order to blend in, he needs to find some clothing. He's got to wear some clothing first. Um, but of course, the moment they resist, he resorts to killing them. Um, you know, he would prefer clothes with no blood on them, but he'll take the clothes with blood if he has to. But that's all part of his infiltration. So I think that everything in the movie is really set up really well. Um, uh, it it Everything does really make a whole lot of sense when you actually analyze it and go through it. Um, and it is supposed to be a closed loop. I think it was supposed to be a one and done story told, but it was successful, and eventually it's not one of those things where they made a sequel immediately, because we were talking from 1984 with the first one. I believe the second one is 1991. So there was a gap of time in there. It wasn't like Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th where they just kept pumping them out one after another. um, During the 80s, there was a time gap. And the second movie changes tones drastically because I really feel like tonally wise, even though it's a science fiction setup for the movie, tonally wise, the first Terminator movie is a horror movie. That's the overall vibe. It's a basic slasher. He kills everyone in the movie trying to get to his final girl, um, which is Sarah Connor. It's really um, it's depicted that way. Um, and obviously it has the elements of the sci-fi. The sci-fi is the catalyst for the whole thing. It also has elements of a romance between Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor. It's got all that elements, but really overall, I think it feels like a horror movie. Um, Terminator 2 Judgment Day is some people's pick for their favorite movie of all time, and it's right up there with my favorite movie of all time. I mean, it's one, it's one on a very short list of favorite movies of all time. And even that being said, though, it's so often compete with the first Terminator for which one is the best. You got your fans in the camp of Terminator 1, fans in the camp of Terminator 2. Now, I will admit that Terminator 2 is not as flawless of a movie as the first Terminator, but on some levels it's more enjoyable. It's an action movie. It switches from the first movie being a horror movie to this one being an action movie. I feel like, of course, some horror elements are probably still there, definitely less so in this movie. Um, and of course, the science fiction thing lingers throughout the entire franchise. But to me, this is an action movie. Um, uh, yeah, um, uh, this movie's fantastic. And by the way, I know that there are different cuts of this movie, theatrical cut and director's cut. I think a lot of people nowadays are only familiar with the director's cut because it's been put on so many streaming services and videos. And I think some of the things that people complain about this movie are actually less so in the theatrical cut. So if you can get a copy of the theatrical cut, or you get a DVD that includes both theatrical cut and extended cut, director's cut, whatever, maybe give the theatrical cut a try if if you're one of the people who's not as big a fan as Terminator 2, if you've only seen the director's cut or the cut that's on available on most videos, try the theatrical cut because it cuts some of the stuff out that I hear people complain about a lot, like too much interaction between John and the robot, and scene where Arnold Schwarzenegger smiles. I don't think is in the theatrical cut. Stuff like that. I mean, I kind of like some of that stuff because he is trying to teach Arnold how to be more human, and I think that the movie really does strike an emotional chord. Um, Overall, between both cuts or whatever, it strikes an emotional chord where at the end of the movie, I'm kind of feeling a little sorry for the Terminator, um, where he is. Uh, he's kind of, it's like he kind of understands more uh, what is human and what is not, or kind of understands the human condition a little bit more. And they explain it as like he has a learning chip that has to be turned on, and they do that in the movie. um like it's kind of this weird thing, and there's like a lot of um emotional elements that are explored in the movie, like at one point Sarah Connor herself almost becomes a Terminator. She almost becomes machine like. She becomes the killing machine. um she wants to change the future. This movie definitely presents a different version of time travel from the other movie, where it does seem like it's possible to change the future, where it seems like Sarah attacking and doing all this didn't happen in the other version of history. We've got a new version of history now where Sarah tries to prevent Judgment Day. In fact, there is an alternate ending where they do show Sarah and John in the future, and they have been successful in preventing Judgment Day. They show them in the future in the alternate ending. Sarah is an old woman. John is a middle-aged man or whatever, and he has a child of his own now. And Sarah's a grandmother. She's old age, and so they prevented Judgment Day from happening. And that is, um, you know, something that they do in that version with that alternate ending. In the other ultimate, in the original ending, it's more vague, where they're traveling the open road. They've destroyed everything. They believe that they've changed the future, but they don't know for sure. That's the ending that leads into part 3. But in an alternate timeline somewhere, we have the alternate ending, I guess you could say, of Terminator 2, where they actually do prevent Judgment Day. They prevent the machines and Skynet and everything from taking over. And Terminators are never built, and they live in a happy future where there's no war between humans and machines. Um, so, you know, we're getting into different versions of what would happen, but it seems like, Arnold, the Arnold bot, supplies her with information that then uh, turns around, and she is able to use that information to actually change the outcome of the future, which, it rings the question for those who subscribe to the closed loop version of time travel, where the future and the past and the present, everything is always set. It always happens the way that it happens, regardless if anyone travels through time or not. It always happens that way. It brings up the question then, okay, well, if that's the way that it always happens, why is that? Why can't you use knowledge of the future, knowledge of what was your past that you know because you've traveled backwards in time and now has become the future again? Why wouldn't you be able to use that knowledge in order to change an outcome? If you know a certain person is alive in the future, if you killed that person, why then that would change the timeline going forward, because that person would no longer be alive to do the things that they did in the future that you remember. So why wouldn't you be able to change the future? You know, using that knowledge that you have, it's a good question to ask. And in this version, in Terminator 2, they do seemingly change the future. They seemingly have destroyed everything that would have caused Judgment Day from happening in 1997, the year that this date is. Now, the first movie never gives a date for Judgment Day, the day when the machines take over the destruction of the world and as we knew it and stuff, and start the war between the humans and the machines. The date is never given in the first movie. He starts out by saying a few years from now they develop some sort of technology, and then blah, 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 and leads to the future that he came from. But in the second movie we find out it's 1997. Now, the only way she could have that knowledge is if Kyle Reese told her, which means that he would have had to tell her at some point when they're not on screen, at some point when we cut to the Terminator or something, or a time jump between scenes in the movie where there's unaccounted for time between Kyle and Sarah. At some point, Kyle must have told Sarah the year when Judgment Day happens in order for the second movie to make sense. So Sarah knows when it's going to happen, the information that Kyle gave her. It kind of brings up how old is John Connor. This is a fun little silly thing in this movie. These movies. The second movie definitely takes place the first movie definitely takes place in 1984, meaning that John Connor was conceived in 84. Now, I believe they give us the exact date, and I should have written it down ahead of time, but I want to say it's May 10th, something like that, of 1984. They tell us in the movie, is it Tuesday, May 10th or whatever? They even give the day of the week and everything. So that's all in the first movie. So that's when Kyle Reese is or John Connor is conceived. Kyle Reese being his biological father. In the second movie, John Connor then, if the movie takes place, which no date is ever given as far as I can tell, if the movie takes place on the year of release in 1991, given that John Connor was born in 85, in fact, conceived in 84, born in 85, we can even see his birthday pop up on the screen when the police officer is looking up Kyle Reese's record to go try to find him, or I should say the liquid metal Terminator impersonating a police officer, killing him, taking imitating his police officer outfit, and then getting in the cop car and basically becoming that person after he kills him. We see him pull up on the in-car computer John Connor's file, and it says he was born in 85, confirming the first movie would make sense if he was conceived in May of 84. So, if we're talking 1991, if he is born in 85, that would be 86, 87, 88, 89, 90, 91. That would make him 6 years old, or or I guess 5 or 6 years old, depending on whether this is before or after his birthday in 1991. So since he doesn't seem to be only like 5 or 6 years old, then we would say, okay, maybe this movie takes place a few years later. But remember, Judgment Day happens in 97, so this has to be a few years off from 97. Even the Terminator confirms this when he tells them about Miles Dyson, who is the man mainly responsible for creating Skynet and doing all this kind of stuff, this artificial intelligence that leads to Judgment Day happening in 97. Basically it's indicated, it's never given the exact number of years, but it says on there, it's indicated what he is, what he's doing in developing this technology that will lead to this. So it seems like it's still a few years off. But even if we place this movie as happening in 97 for someone born in 85, that makes him a maximum of 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. Even if this movie happens earlier in 97 and Judgment Day happens later in the year, he's only 11 or 12 years old. And this kid in this movie seems to be between the age of 12 to 14. If you look at the movie, that's the age range I would give for John Connor's character. I believe the actor was 13 when he played the character. So yeah, 12 to 14 is a good range of how old he looks to be. And of course, age is always more noticeable with children. But it doesn't seem to make sense to place this movie in 97 and have him be 12 years old maximum, because it still seems like they're several years away from developing the technology that leads to Skynet. So John Connor's age doesn't seem to make much sense. Definitely not 5 or 6 years old. We've got to set this movie at least a few years later than 91, just to try to make John Connor's age make more sense. If we can get him up to being a minimum of 9 years old, but then we have to set the movie in, let's see, born in 85, so we have to set the movie in 94 at least to make him 9 years old. Which, that gives you 3 years. That gives you 3 years from where Miles Dyson is at that point in time to the point where he gets to create Skynet, the artificial intelligence. And yeah, I think you have to also reconcile it with what the words we actually hear Arnold say on in the movie when he gives all that information and he explains all that kind of stuff. So the first and second movie, the biggest things when putting them together and putting it all together is John Connor's age. Uh, oh, and then the third movie literally says in the third movie that we have John Connor come up and say that they tried to kill him before he was born, and then again when he was 13, confirming his age was supposed to be 13 in the second movie. And it's like, oh my goodness, 13. How do you even get that? Because then, if he was born in 85, it has to be like 1998 when he turns 13 in 1998. So the third movie, I mean, obviously in the third movie they're referencing the first two movies. It seems clear that that's what they're doing, but man, the timeline does not make sense because they prevented Judgment Day from happening before it happened, and it happened in 97. So John should have been 12 when it happened. So if the Terminator, if they were trying to kill John, referencing the third movie or the second movie when John was 13, that totally screws up the timeline. John can't be 13 years old in that movie, which means that to really make it consistent, you'd have to say that the third movie takes place in an alternate universe where something similar to the second movie happened, but it happened when John was 13. And do they reference 97 in part 3? Because maybe if they do, then the only reasonable explanation is to say that part 3 comes from an alternate universe where John was born earlier than 85. So, yikes. So something similar to what happened in the first two movies that we saw happen, but they happened at different times than the first two movies that we actually saw in the world of Terminator 3. So there you go. It seems to be disjointed from the other two, even though that probably wasn't the intent of the filmmakers to disjoint it from the other two. It doesn't really seem to make sense time-wise for it to take place in the same universe as the other two. Again, unless you want to ignore ages and just say that it's an alternate universe where people age differently than calendars. 1 year of life is counted differently than the way that 1 year of time is counted in this alternate universe, where you can be 13 years old several years before 1997, even if you were born in 85. It's like, that doesn't, it's like, how does that make sense at all? So, third movie, the second movie introduces the liquid metal Terminator. We had the regular cyborg in the first movie with the skin covering the endoskeleton made of metal. So basically a robot covered in human skin makes a cyborg. In Judgment Day, we get the liquid metal Terminator, can imitate human skin or whatnot, or anything that it touches really, but it's actually made of metal. In the third movie, we do get an upgrade a little bit because this liquid metal Terminator can actually change itself into some complex machinery. At the beginning of the movie, she has basically a gun of some sort that gets damaged, and when it's damaged because of the damage that she's taken in the movie, then she has to switch over to a uh, a flamethrower or whatever she has, because her gun setting is damaged. She could change her arm into a gun or a flamethrower or whatever. The liquid metal Terminator in the second movie couldn't do that. It's explained that he can only do simple shapes, not complex moving parts like machines have. As far as his abilities, shape shifting, are concerned. It brings up a lot of questions as to how exactly the liquid metal thing even works. In later movies, they do talk about a computer chip being in the liquid metal Terminators. So I guess as long as that computer chip isn't completely destroyed, it's able to send electrical currents through and make the liquid metal Terminator move and do and imitate humans and all that. So it's an AI computer chip in the Terminator itself. Seems to be the explanation that makes the most sense, with electrical currents moving, controlling the rest of the liquid metal. If you're going to try to make sense of the Terminators. But anyway, it's a more advanced model in Terminator 3. The TX, or Terminatrix, is designed to kill rogue Terminators that have been reprogrammed by the Resistance. This movie presents the idea that rather than preventing Judgment Day at the end of part 2, they only delayed it. Again, I think the filmmakers intended it to be a sequel to part 2, a direct sequel to the first two movies, even if timeline-wise it doesn't really make any sense. But anyway, yes, the idea is that, he says, I thought we prevented Judgment Day, and Arnold tells him, no, you've only delayed it. Which, again, Arnold does switch from a bad guy in the first movie to a good guy in parts 2 and 3. And both times it's supposed to be a reprogrammed Terminator, where he's been reprogrammed now by the Resistance, by the human Resistance, and he's on their team now. This, idea that the Arnold bot even exists is kind of crazy on some levels when you think about it. First of all, Arnold Schwarzenegger is about the last person who, especially if you ever seen Arnold Schwarzenegger back in the 70s and 80s, if you were to guess someone in the room was a robot or an alien from another planet trying to pretend to be human, if you put him in a room full of 100 people and you ask them, okay, which one of these is not a real human just pretending to be human, you pick Arnold Schwarzenegger. But to have multiple versions of this guy, even in the third movie, they're like, what, do you come off an assembly line? And he's like, yeah, because, the first two Arnold parts were destroyed in each movie. So now in the third movie, you're like, oh, what did you do? Come off an assembly line? And it's like, yeah. So they make a little joke out of it, a little comic relief. But it's where it's the way that it's put together, it doesn't make a very good infiltration unit if all of your robots look the same, especially if they all look like Arnold Schwarzenegger did in 1984, looking like he's got access to the world's best gym when the humans are living off of rats they can kill and eat, and all of human civilization has crumbled, but Arnold is there looking like he pumps iron every single day. It doesn't make a lot of sense from that standpoint. Now, I think part of it is that they took DNA from someone and they maybe only have so many copies of usable human DNA to make the Terminators with, that they've replicated in such a way that they can put, build this human tissue around the the metal skeleton that the robots themselves are made of, and then they get the human tissue around it. Maybe it's the development of human cloning or whatever it is that allows them to use DNA to um, form around these robots and do it. So maybe they only have so many, or they've only used so many, or just because that's the way machines think, that they haven't realized the problem with making 100 robots that all look exactly the same. But it's like you already got the assembly line set up, so you might as well produce 50 of them at a time, or 100 at a time, or however many Arnold bots they made when they made them. um, get more bang for your buck, I guess. Create a few. But, obviously, when people see those, they're going to be like, oh my goodness, how many of these guys are there? Are they twins? Are they triplets? Are they quadruplets? What's going on here? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you saw too many of them too close together. Um, but yeah, I mean, the idea that they made multiple versions of this particular robot, allows Arnold to come back and be in every movie, which is fun. Whatever. Um, so, yeah, Terminator 3 is a fun action movie with all of its, weird things trying to figure out John's age. Um, it's a fun action movie. Uh, um, Terminator Salvation. Now, this is one where they really tried to do something different with the franchise, because the first three movies, they send two beings back in time. In the first movie, it's Kyle Reese and the Arnold bot. In the second movie, it's a reprogrammed Arnold bot and T-1000, the liquid metal Terminator. In the third movie, it's another Arnold bot. Again, the Arnold bot is the good guy in this one, and then the Terminatrix, the TX, is the bad guy. In the fourth movie, instead of sending two beings back through time, one to try to, keep somebody alive, and the other one to try to kill that person, and the interplay between those. The fourth movie does change up the formula of the franchise and sets an entire movie in the dystopian future in which Judgment Day did happen. It's I think it's not I think it's I think if you follow the stuff that comes up in the movie, I think this is a version where Judgment Day happens in 2003, which I think is supposed to be the year that the third film is set in, like 2002 or 2003, something like that. So this one is trying to be incongruent with that one, where at the end of Terminator 3 we actually see Judgment Day happen, because Judgment Day wasn't prevented in the second movie, it was just delayed. Um, and you can delay it, but you can't prevent it. It would happen eventually. It was inevitable. That's what the third movie tells us. In the fourth movie, now we actually get to see a movie set post Judgment Day, where the war between the machines and the humans is happening. Um, and so I will give Salvation credit for changing the formula. It's really kind of a different original idea, the most original since the first, because now we actually get a movie set differently and having different stuff going on than what we saw in the first couple of movies. Now, this movie, the thing that's different about the Malcolm Terminator, or semi-Terminator thing that we see in this movie that we didn't see in the other movies, where it really changes up, is that this Terminator has like a human heart and a human brain and stuff. It's definitely the first time that it's ever implied that it has a human brain. Before that, the Terminators are always machines controlled by their robot brain, their computer chips, and you know, motherboard or whatever they've got in their body that located in the head, I presume, that how they can function as you know it, these human-like but clearly not human things. But in this movie, Malcolm is carrying out this thing, this secret directive that we find out at the end of the movie that he didn't even know he was doing the whole time. So he's partially, it's like the human is interacting with the machine, and he's got a computer chip in his brain that's causing him to do certain things, which he then pulls out or whatever towards the end of the movie. And there's a whole thing happening with him and John Connor. That the whole mission was to lure John Connor back to the machine headquarters and kill him at machine headquarters. And Malcolm was a part of that plan. They do say in this movie, the only time travel, which this is the only movie that doesn't really deal with time travel, at least not in any significant way, but time travel does come into play a little bit in this movie, because the number one person on the machine's hit list is Kyle Reese, not John Connor. John Connor is number 2, Kyle Reese is number 1. And so at this point, the machines are aware that Kyle Reese is John Connor's father. However, John speculates that they think that by killing Kyle, that it will wipe John out of existence. That doesn't seem to happen. Or they had the opportunity to kill Kyle Reese. He gets captured. He gets taken to the camp. They set him in a cell by himself. They have every opportunity to kill him. From the moment he was captured, they could have just killed Kyle Reese immediately. But they didn't. They set him in the prison and then, or in a special room or something. And he ends up getting saved by John. And in the end, John and Kyle Reese both survive. But they could have killed him immediately after they discovered that he was among the humans they had captured, but they choose not to. And so that makes me wonder, is it just a flaw in the writing of the movie itself that they don't kill him immediately so that, they can save the day? Or if we're trying to make it make sense in the universe, they don't actually believe that killing Kyle Reese will change the timeline and stop John Connor from ever being born, killing Kyle Reese before he travels back in time to 1984. They don't believe that that'll actually work. Maybe by this point in this particular timeline, they've kind of figured out how time travel actually works, and they no longer believe that killing Kyle Reese will actually erase John Connor from history. They will still have to deal with the John Connor who is there in their present, even if they kill Kyle Reese, is what it seems like. It seems like this whole thing was a plan to get Kyle Reese and John Connor both in the same place at the same time and probably just kill them both. But they don't think that that's going to have a ripple effect through the timeline if they kill Kyle Reese before he goes back in time to make John Connor never exist. That doesn't seem to be what they're actually going for, because if they were, they had the opportunity to kill Kyle Reese before John Connor even got there. John Connor finds him like locked in a room. They could have killed him immediately. They had the resources to kill Kyle Reese. It doesn't make sense from that point of view. But anyway, we do get a new interesting variant on the Terminator where they've left enough of the human intact so that he thinks he's human. He wakes up not knowing what happens. The last thing he remembers, he was in prison. He wakes up and doesn't know what's even happening, and eventually that leads to the rest of the movie. But it's discovered he's still got a human brain and whatnot, and this was the master plan of the Terminators for either him to kill John Connor himself, or for him to lure John Connor back to the lab and kill him there, or whatever it is. But they're using the interaction of the computer programming. He's kind of been manipulated in his decision making by some computer program to find John Connor and to lead him back to the base or whatever, or kill him. Maybe he just doesn't kill John Connor because he never gets the opportunity to kill John Connor until after he's led back to the base, when he makes the decision to pull the computer chip out and to live on his human side rather than his robotic side. It's going there, but it does seem like they, at this point, don't actually think that killing Kyle Reese will kill John Connor or wipe him from existence or whatever, even though under maybe different rules of time travel that would work, but those don't seem to be the rules of time travel in this franchise, which I think is expanded on in the next film more. Okay, so next film is Genesis. In this film, the timeline is messed with again. So now Terminators are sent even further back in time to try to kill Sarah Connor when she is just a little girl, instead of the adult version of Sarah Connor that we get in Terminator. In that version of 1984 we get in the first Terminator movie. Now they try to kill her when she's a little girl, but she's saved by a good guy Terminator once again. And then we see the good guy Terminator age come up, 1984. We see good guy Terminator now in Sarah Connor save Kyle Reese once he travels back in time. But now this other Terminator, the same Terminator that killed Sarah's parents and tried to kill her when she was a little girl, is still there, I guess, from the time that she was 10 years old, or however old she's supposed to be when the Terminator attempts to kill her the first time. And when we get to 1984, the liquid metal Terminator, who's basically a T-1000, although a slight upgrade, because he is able to reactivate other Terminators just by simply like dashing a little bit of his liquid metal on them, reactivates what was otherwise a dead Terminator in this movie somehow. Like the liquid metal gives him the something or other. Maybe it's filled with nanobots or something. I don't know. And it's able to bring that dead Terminator back to life. We do get an encounter from the old Terminator that was sent back in like the 60s or 70s when Sarah Connor was a little girl, probably 70s, I guess. Between that one, now aged older because it's 1984, we get a showdown between him and the Terminator that is sent to the year 1984. And they did a really good job of creating a Terminator that actually looked like the 1984 Arnold Bart. The scenes that take place in 1984, they do a really good job of recreating the atmosphere from the first movie and getting lookalike and redoing it. It's kind of like a Back to the Future Part 2 scenario where they go back to the first movie. That's what this one does in going back to 1984. Then they create this whole scenario where they have to go to the future, which definitely creates another one of these time travel problems that is kind of like the reason why I guess they didn't kill Kyle Reese in part 3 was because, well, they go to 1984, or they leave 1984 and go to what is 2017 to prevent the launch of the new Skynet, which is now called Genesis. And when they do so, they travel to the future for the first time in the franchise, and they do so, and even though they left 1984 without ever having sex and without John ever having given birth, it doesn't wipe John Connor from existence. Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor never have sex in 1984, and John Connor still exists. Now, the John Connor from the future went back in time after he was infected by nanobots, which replaced his human DNA and turned John Connor into a Terminator, who is sort of a nanobot liquid metal hybrid, maybe, or just nanobot, I don't know, Terminator, who still exists even though he was never conceived again. So he was able to go back in time from the point where he was in the future, to go back in time to go to 2017 to oversee the or whatever it is, 15, 16, 17, whatever it is, to oversee the creation of Genesis, which we used to call Skynet, but we're now in some alternate universe where it became Genesis because of some decisions affecting the future. It seems like some decisions affect the future and other decisions don't, or they create alternate timelines, but then somehow this John Connor ends up in the same timeline that they're already in. So it's like, how many timelines are there, and how do you determine which timeline you end up in? And John Connor is obviously not in the same timeline that he came from. In fact, the timeline he's traveling to, he was never born. And he's not really John Connor anymore. Now he's a robot. So, I don't know. But he still has John Connor's memory, so he's still on some level human. And he has a weakness to giant magnets, which makes you wonder how he got through the time machine in the first place, because that was supposed to be the whole reason. When you have weakness to giant magnets, which the Terminatrix in Terminator 3 also has weakness to giant magnets, the TX, but we only see her weakness to those giant magnets after she's taken a lot of damage. So maybe that's the reason, because of all the damage she's sustained, that creates her weakness to giant magnets. But in this one, this John Connor Terminator has received basically no damage when we see his weakness to the giant magnets. So how does that make sense in the grand scheme of it? How was he even able to travel through the time machine? And I think it's in the next movie, Dark Fate, where we see what happens if you try to travel through the time machine with exposed metal and all that kind of stuff, and the non-living tissue, and why they had to be naked in the first place. We finally see the use of the time machine in that sense. So maybe he travels through time before his body has completely converted over to being a full Terminator. Maybe that's the explanation for Terminator Genesis, how John Connor gets through time. And again, we already have the problem with the liquid metal Terminators traveling through time. They're not actually made of human tissue. They're just imitating the look of human tissue. They're not actually supposed to be made of human tissue. So how do they get through? Um, but um, uh, you know, that's Terminator Genesis. It's basically the same thing as the others. You got two going through time. Um, uh, One to protect, one to kill. Um, but the extra elements of we see more time travel. We visit different years. We're seeing what's going on through multiple things. Um, and but once again, it's trying to stop Genesis from launching, so it's trying to prevent Judgment Day. In kind of like the third movie, where they go directly almost to Judgment Day and try to prevent it right before it happens. In Terminator Genesis, in the third movie, it's the day of Judgment Day, and everything is way too far gone. They're not able to prevent it, but in the second movie, they apparently are able to prevent it right before it happens. Or in Genesis, they're able to prevent it right before it happens. All right. All right. So we kind of finished up talking about Genesis there. I think I mentioned everything I wanted to say about that movie. It's kind of it's just a different. I will give it credit for throwing in some different elements, but at the same time, still sort of doing the same thing as the other, as the first three movies in a way. So Dark Fate. So they bring back Edward Furlong, who had played John Connor in Part 2, which I believe is the only time in the entire franchise that John Connor has ever been played by the same actor again. In Part 2 and now Part 6, the sixth movie for Dark Fate. So this one kind of basically takes place in an alternate universe where Part 2 definitely happened, but none of the others after that did. I think it's like Part 1 and Part 2 is implied that kind of happened, or whatever, if Part 1 and Part 2 even take place in the same timeline. But John Connor's age doesn't seem to make sense. That's why I say they couldn't that it might not even be in the same timeline. We just may be in a timeline similar to the timeline we saw in Part 1. But anyway, but yeah, they bring back Edward Furlong. They digitized his face to make it look younger, so that this looks like it's happening just shortly after the Part 2, or the opening scene looks like it's happening shortly after Part 2. We see, John and Sarah both basically the same age as they were in Part 2. It's only supposed to be, months later, maybe a year later at the most, something like that. And then we see another Terminator show up in that year, and when they were kind of caught off guard and unexpecting it, and John dies. So they brought back Edward Furlong just to kill him off without ever even showing his real face. In the movie, they just digitized his face and did everything forced perspective to make him look like he was the same John Connor from Part 2. I mean, it is the same actor, but eh, you know, I mean, they could have used the body double for that instead of getting the real Edward Furlong, and just did everything digitally to make it look like him, because that's what they ended up doing anyway. And of course, with the period of time that had passed between Terminator 2 and Terminator Dark Fate, you know, he was much older, and you know, when you see him in real life now, he's gained weight. You know, it happens to all of us, you know, and stuff. Um, Nothing against the actor himself, but you know, he's you know, looks much more like a different person, which is maybe why they decided not to use him for the bulk of the movie. Um, but whatever. They bring back uh, Linda Hamilton to play Sarah Connor again, which is the first time she ha- um, has been played by her son's part two. She played her in part one and part two, and now again in Dark Fate. Um, and in part three, in that timeline, she's dead, and in part four, in Salvation, she died a long time ago. Um, so Genesis is really it has a Sarah Connor, but played by a different actress, and she, you know, the main bulk of when we see her is supposed to be Sarah Connor in 1984, but obviously just played by a different younger actress who is now uh, supposed to be that version of Sarah Connor. Sarah Connor at whatever age she is supposed to be in that film from part one. Uh, which in that film she's supposed to be a college student working part time at a diner. If you pick that up in the movie, the college student thing is kind of subtle. It's not really brought up and not really talked about that much in the film, since the film takes place only over a few days and she immediately exits college. I'm sure she doesn't go back to college after the end of that movie, but yeah, there is this scene where you see the Terminator gets a hold of her IDs, so then the Terminator from that point knows what she looks like, and he gets her college ID. That's the ID that he sees. So apparently she is a college student, or maybe she was a college student, and that's an old ID from when she took classes, but then she dropped out. I don't know. It's kind of hard to tell, but she is working at a diner. We do see that in the first movie. But anyway, this is, of course, you know, by the time you get to Genesis, too many years have passed. Maybe the facial technology of digitizing wasn't what they wanted it to be. So, but for whatever reason, they just went ahead and had her played by a different actress. And of course, it's supposed to be long periods of time where it's supposed to be 1984 Sarah Connor. Of course, she doesn't look like Linda Hamilton in that movie, who made the role iconic in the first two Terminators. But they do bring Linda Hamilton back for Dark Fate. And when they bring her back, except for that one scene where John Connor dies, after that she is playing her real life age, or whatever. They're just Linda Hamilton as she is now, or as she was during the year that they filmed Dark Fate. A much older version now. So, again, it does seem like Judgment Day was prevented, but the Terminator that kills John was apparently sent back in time from the future around the same time that the Terminator 2 Terminators were sent back, but it took a while after the events of Terminator 2 for that Terminator to catch up. It's like he went to a different location, or he was waiting to see how the other events played out. I don't know what is up with that, with how to explain that exactly, because this, if he goes to a different location, this is the first time it's really ever implied that the space or the time travel machine can move you locations, um, so to speak. I mean, in the first movie that Kyle Reese and the Terminator don't go to the exact same location, but they both end up in the city of Los Angeles. And I think that's where they traveled through time, but like maybe the time displacement because the space time continuum, moves a little bit, so they don't end up in exactly the same location, coming from exactly the same spot. And it doesn't even appear that they even arrived at the same exact time, but just shortly apart from each other, at least the way the movie is cut. Um, so there does seem be some sort of distortion there in the space-time continuum. But to have this Terminator be sent back in time at the same time that Terminator 2, Terminator 2, Terminator is sent back, or so, I don't know, was he sent to a slightly different time so you could just wait and see how Terminator 2 played out, and and be the to kill John afterwards in case John survived. What happened if he survived the liquid metal Terminator, then get him with another one, or some, it's kind of interesting. I don't know if they ever explain it in the movie. They sort of do, I think, talk about it, whatever. And then this Terminator, I guess, can sense disturbances in the space-time continuum, because every time a Terminator is sent back, he sends Sarah Connor coordinates to the Terminator so that Sarah Connor can go fight Terminators once they come back. And that's the thing that happens in between scenes from when we see young Sarah Connor to the much older Sarah Connor in more modern day. And what year did this movie come out? 20, 21, 22, 23. No, not 23. It didn't come out this year. 20 around 2019 maybe. I don't know. 2018, 2019, 2020, something like that. This one, yeah, it's, I guess so. I guess the Terminator that killed John, after he killed John, completed his mission. And after he completed his mission, he began to regret the decision they made. He became more human over time. Not sure who turned on his emotion switch or whatever, like they imply in the second movie. Maybe this one was built differently. Maybe someone did turn it on. Maybe this, maybe that. Yeah, this one, I guess, just becomes more human over time from living amongst the humans since whatever year Terminator 2 is supposed to take place. Since shortly after the events of Terminator 2, he kills John, then he goes and lives among humans, and I guess kind of develops subconscious over time, and he gives things to Sarah that then allows Sarah to be in the movie. It gives her a purpose after John dies of killing Terminators, because apparently Terminators from different times, different timelines, I don't even know, are sent back, or frequently, or maybe they were all sent back at once from a particular future to multiple different points in time. But anyways, just so that Linda Hamilton can be in this movie. The main plot of the movie takes place in whatever year it's set in, whatever year it came out. I'm presuming it's the year it's set in. And now there's a new thing going on where there is a new version of Skynet, but not Skynet, because Skynet was destroyed, so some other company did the exact same thing instead. So it's Skynet, but not Skynet. Kind of like how Skynet became Genesis in the last movie in an alternate timeline. And there's a new leader of the resistance. At first, Sarah Connor assumes that she's supposed to be the mother of the of kind of the savior of the human resistance, but then it's later revealed, oh no, she's not the mother, she is the leader of the human resistance. And it's this woman named Danny. And it's this movie makes some weird parallels and kind of brings out something that probably didn't need to be mentioned in the movie. That being the kind of the resemblance between kind of the Christian story, the Christian religion, and the narrative of Jesus and being born of the Virgin Mary and all that kind of stuff, where they kind of point out that that's kind of, it could be a parallel there in the first couple in the first part of the franchise. All the other movies revolved around John Connor being the leader of the resistance, and Sarah Connor kind of giving birth to John Connor, or the biological father John Connor being a time traveler, so like his son is born before he's ever born. This type of stuff, it's weird. It's almost like, like John Connor in a way is this like supernatural, immaculately conceived being or something, because his existence makes no sense in a linear sense. It only comes about through time travel, and that kind of stuff. So it's like parallels to the Christian story of Jesus and the virgin birth and being the Son of God and all that kind of stuff. This movie kind of comments on that a little bit, and then it kind of switches the focus, though, from Jesus focus to Mary centric, because now the woman is the savior of the human resistance to the machines, instead of the son that she gives birth to. It's kind of weird. This movie makes those references, like I think Sarah Connor even says birth of the savior or something. You're the mother of the savior of mankind or something like that. And so it's kind of weird that they draw that comparison. I mean, but there are some things that do seem somewhat parallel in this story that they're telling to the beliefs of the Christian religion. So they do this whole thing, and this movie kind of gets weird with its it trying to make some sort of political statements with its stuff that goes on, like the moving, the going to Mexico and having that be the center, and then they have to sneak into the United States to get back, and all this kind of stuff that happens. Terminator's trying to kill them the whole way. Now there is this weird kind of human hybrid that has some, I guess she was about to die, so they saved her with some machine parts or something, and now she has like this partial thing. She is in a way a cyborg herself, but she still has her human brain, is on the human side, and she's one of the good guys in the movie, one of the people on the human side of this equation. you know, which is a different variation that we haven't seen before, although it is very similar in many ways to Marcus, who we saw in Salvation. Um, Except for she's not being controlled by a microchip because she's still got a lot of human parts, but she doesn't have a microchip in her brain making her secretly act on behalf of the machines. You know, she's more human, but she's like a cybernetically enhanced human rather than a full-on cyborg. Marcus is probably a little bit more on the cyborg part of the equation. um, but then again, maybe not, because he ultimately chooses his human half over his machine half. Um, so what does this movie do differently? The one thing it really does differently, or the one upgrade it makes to the Terminators that we haven't seen before, is we see a Terminator with both liquid metal components, but also the endoskeleton underneath, which isn't totally unique because we did see that in Terminator 3, where the the TX, the TX had those elements to her, but in her case, it's less emphasized, but you can see, and you do see in that movie, that she definitely has an endoskeleton underneath her liquid metal shape-shifting thing, whereas the Terminator in the previous movie before that, Terminator 2, it was entirely, or seemingly entirely, made of liquid metal, as is one of the Terminators we see in Genesis, even though it is an upgrade from the liquid metal Terminator we see in Terminator 2. Or it seems to be an upgrade. We don't think that Terminator from Terminator 2 had the ability to reactivate dead Terminators. But one thing I forgot to mention here is that the Terminator in Terminator 3 does have the ability to control other machines, to take over other machines, and because they're all hooked to the internet or something, I don't know, and like able to drive cars that she's not actually in. She drives them just with her computer mind or something. She's able to take over other machines and drive the other cars. Gives her more weapons at her arsenal, and I think there might be a little bit of implied something for that. Do they ever use that again in Genesis? I don't remember. But in Dark Fate, I don't think it ever is used again, actually. I think it's only in Terminator 3 that has that ability. But the big thing about the Dark Fate Terminator, what makes him different from the Terminatrix, is that he can't turn his body into guns or flamethrowers or stuff like that. Like, it's not like we see the Terminator 3 do one. So it's coming from a different alternate universe and doesn't have those abilities. But the one ability that this liquid metal Terminator with an endoskeleton has in Dark Fate that we haven't seen in any other movie is the ability to separate the two. So we see we can see that he can separate his liquid metal shape-shifting type of Terminator from the endoskeleton underneath that's just a robot, made of metal. That we haven't seen before. We saw the combination of the two in Terminator 3, but we didn't see them able to separate from each other and act independently. So it's almost like you take the robot after it's been stripped of its flesh, like all the human tissue burned away, like what eventually happened to Arnold in the first movie, um, and we saw him in his fully metal skeleton form towards the end of the first movie, and that happens here in this movie. It's able to separate, be a fully metal skeleton on its own, while it has um, the liquid metal part can totally manifest itself separately from that, but they can also combine together, which is a pretty neat feature. When, of course, when you're blending in with humans and trying to be human, you don't want to give yourself away. You blend in and just appear as a normal human with the metal skeletons separated. But then when you're going into full kill mode, you can separate the two, and now it's kind of two against one type of thing, where you can have um, one metal skeleton on one side, and the liquid metal Terminator on the other side, both fighting with the same goal in mind, which is to kill their target, whatever, whoever their target happens to be, their target thing that they were sent on the mission to kill. Uh, one thing that I really don't like about Dark Fate, and I have to mention this, uh, is Arnold Schwarzenegger's character in this. I think he becomes too human. I realize that there's a good number of years from when he kills John Connor to when we kind of pick back up and meet him again in this movie. But in between, at some point, he started sending messages to Sarah Connor. Um, and yeah, I just have a real issue with this one. Um, I don't like the way Arnold is used in this movie. I know a lot of people don't like Pops, the Pops character from Genesis, but this is the one I have the biggest problem with. This um, Terminator, who's apparently never reprogrammed, he just becomes human over time. Or he adapts to human life more over time from just living among humans. After his mission was completed, he just went and lived among the humans. And I think that's a really bad way to portray the Terminators, and I just don't like it. And there's a scene in this movie that really sums it up for me. It's he's going uh, to he's going to join up with the other group of the humans, some of whom have traveled through time, or they met in this time, or whatever. They're trying to protect Danny now because she's the key to the human resistance, like John Connor was previously. And so when they're going to go fight, and they're gearing up to fight, and they've recruited the Terminator who killed John to help them fight because now he's a good guy. And that's the Arnold bot, the Arnold Schwarzenegger, playing this character. Um, he appears in every movie. I guess in Salvation, it's not actually him, it's just digitized to look like him. And he only appears very briefly in the movie. It's supposed to be, it's a digitized, like, CGI version to make it look like 1984 Arnold, like he just stepped off the assembly line. But but yeah, they take him, and he's about to leave his family, because that's something he did in this movie, was form a family with him. He has a wife that he doesn't have sex with, but he has a wife, and then he has a son, a stepson, so to speak, um, and stuff. And he's an interior designer. He designs baby rooms, and sells blinds or whatever it is he does. I think he works at a blind store, sells blinds for putting up curtains on windows or whatever. I mean, it's weird. Um, But he goes to the mirror, and it's like, okay, he's gonna go fight now. It's like, yeah, he's gonna be a Terminator again. He's gonna go fight. He's gonna go do this. He's on a mission. He's got a new directive, a new mission, and he reaches over for his uh, glasses, and he's got these sunglasses like he wears in every movie. He seems to always find a pair of sunglasses to wear. Um, and all these different alternate timelines and stuff, and it's Arnold Schwarzenegger. He looks cool with sunglasses on. All right, so he goes to put them on, and then decides not to and put them down. I thought the movie, just this one scene shot differently, would have made the entire movie better. I thought, he picks up the sunglasses, he actually, puts them on, and then, like the old Terminator theme from like one of the first two movies or whatever, or remix version or whatever, like that music starts to play, that da da, and if that music starts to play, um, it's like, okay, Arnold is back in ass kicking mode again. Uh, but what happens? He doesn't. He doesn't do that. He puts them back down on the counter in the movie, and it's like, oh man, you could have had me there for the end of this finale if you'd have told me, if he put on his sunglasses and like ass kicking mode. It's like back to the old Arnold again. He's gonna go, and he's gonna whoop some butt, and I guess they're trying to show that he changed, and now that he's different, and he's not the killing machine anymore, and he doesn't want to lose his humanity. But at that moment in time, you need him to do that. You can have him towards the end of the film, right before he dies or whatever, like have some human moments or whatever, and resolve the conflict between him and Sarah, because Sarah still holds him accountable for John's death. She hasn't forgiven him for John's death. And you can have that redemption arc in the movie, but you need to do it at the right time. That was the time. I mean, that scene, for him to put on those sunglasses would have been awesome. Instead, he decides not to put them on. So it's like, I just don't get it. Like, why they would have that in the movie? It would be better not to have the sunglasses scene in the movie at all, for him to almost put it on and then decide not to. It would be just better if you just cut the whole scene out of the movie. But I think it was a great scene if they would have just done the obvious thing and had him put the sunglasses on. Then he could have been the Terminator. Then he could have gone back. He could have, it's like, okay, this is ass kicking time. It's time for me to kick some ass. I'm the Terminator. That's what I do. It's time for me to be the Terminator again. I'm not, working at a shop that sells blinds or interior decorator or whatever the heck he's supposed to be in that movie. He goes back to being the Terminator again. Would have been a badass moment for Arnold Schwarzenegger. Would have gotten you hyped for the finale, to see the final showdown, to see Arnold kick some ass again. Yeah, I just don't get it. I don't get the choices that were made. Okay. Here's my ranking. So you got 6 films in this franchise. I don't even know how to rank these. This is real close between my number 5 and my number 6, because both of these two movies have their flaws. But after talking about that one scene just now from Dark Fate, I'm probably going to have to go with Dark Fate as my number 6, because that scene drives me crazy. I hate it. And just overall, it's kind of a whatever movie. The action in it probably is the least action of any of the movies from part 2 onward. which are all kind of in a way action movies. I mean, I guess you could kind of argue that Part 4, Salvation, is a science fiction movie, but it's like action science fiction. It's about 50-50. I don't know. To me, I don't know. The overall franchise is science fiction because the franchise as a whole relies on science fiction concepts so much that the franchise is science fiction, but each individual movie, most of them feel like action movies, with the possible exception of Part 1 and Part 4. So, um, those are the exceptions, possibly Part 4, but the rest of them, I've already said Part 1 feels like a horror movie, but, uh, yeah, so I'm going to go with Dark Fate, number 6, Genesis, number 5, because that one's also just a mess of a movie, and he's getting memories from the future. That's why they go to 2017 instead of 1997, because he's or 2003 or whatever it is, because he sees like Judgment Day moving to whatever year they go to, 2017, 2018, whatever it is. They go to a certain year because he gets memories from the future and all this kind of weird stuff going on, and he sees that's when, when they can prevent Judgment Day and not some other year that makes more sense from the original timeline or whatever. They got to go to the modern year, the year the movie came out, or the year the movie was shot, or whatever it was. They go to basically modern times. um, from 1984, they travel to the future. So, yeah, there's some weird stuff going on in Genesis that I don't care for. I don't care for Dark Fate. So those two are really close. But I'm going with Dark Fate number 6, Genesis number 5. These next two are also really close. You got Salvation and Rise of the Machines. Part 3 and Part 4. Rise of the Machines Part 3, Salvation Part 4. Or the fourth movie in the franchise, I don't know if any of these should be called part whatever, because they all seem to take place in different time, or different time whatevers, alternate timelines and stuff. So I guess the first three, it is called Part 2 and Part 3, or it is Terminator 2 and Terminator 3 for the first couple, but then after that they drop they don't come T4, T5, T6. And then you call them Salvation, Genesis, Dark Fate, so whatever. So, yeah, this is a tough one, but I'm probably going to go with my number 4 being Terminator Salvation. I do like that they try something new and different by setting it in a different setting that we haven't seen before. We don't actually have any characters traveling through time. Time travel is kind of implied in the whole trying to kill Kyle Reese storyline, but the elements of what could possibly happen because of time travel is implied in that part, but we don't actually see anyone travel through time. We don't have the actual time travel that we have in the other films. So, or see someone arrive in the past from the future or whatever. We don't see that and it's really not a part of Salvation. It's just a movie that takes place entirely in the dystopian future after Armageddon or Judgment Day or whatever you want to call it has happened. So I give it credit for trying something new and going in a different direction that we haven't seen from the franchise before, not sticking to the formula and just upgrading a Terminator, although it does kind of give us a new variation of a Terminator that we haven't seen before in the previous films, at least to an extent. A little bit of a new variation, a new plan by the machines and so forth. It just overall, it kind of falls a little flat. It definitely has its action elements, but you could call it a sci-fi movie in the fact that it's a little lower, I think, on the action than the other movies in the franchise. It might be the only one in the franchise that where its primary genre, its number one genre, might be science fiction, just by basis of the fact that it's set in a dystopian future, that it's not, like real world type of stuff or whatever. It's like science fiction type of setting. Um, so it's interesting. But overall, it falls a little flat. Also, there's a scene in this in Terminator Salvation where you can actually see the green screen, where it wasn't filled in with a background. If you look up in the corner on the helicopter crash, it's left in the final cut of the movie. During the helicopter crash, you can see the green screen. Yikes. So man, talk about a production issue on a major Hollywood theatrically released movie. You don't often see mistakes like that left in movies at this high quality level. Alright, so my number 3, so we'll give the bronze medal to Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines. This one is a fun action movie. That's probably why I have to rank it higher than Salvation. It's fun. It's action. It's an action movie. Probably the last time that Arnold Schwarzenegger was actually in good enough shape to convincingly play the Terminator. So, I'll give it to my bronze medal to Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, just for how much fun it is. Alright, this brings me to my top 2. Once again, very, very close here. Do I go with the probably technically better made film, although definitely not in terms of special effects. In terms of special effects, Terminator 2 is better, but in terms of storytelling, in the tightness of the story and the technical aspects of it, Terminator 1 might be better, but I do think Terminator 2 does a fantastic job of taking you on an emotional ride where you actually can feel for the Arnold bot at the end of the movie, and it feels natural. It feels natural that you feel like he's actually become somewhat human, and you kind of feel sorry for him. You feel sad for him when he has to then be destroyed. But circumstances dictate that it's safer for him to be destroyed than for him to go on. And it makes you feel sad when he basically sacrifices himself for the good of John and Sarah and the rest of humanity. If it makes you feel sad for the Terminator when he does that, I do think the movie works and takes you on an emotional ride. And it's a really, really good action movie. It, for the most part, makes pretty much sense, and the liquid metal Terminator, while it may not make very much sense logically, it is a fantastic innovation, and it really feels like they didn't just take the Terminator from the first movie and give him a slight upgrade. They took the Terminator from the first movie and gave him a major upgrade. The liquid metal Terminator, and Robert Patrick, who plays the Terminator, does a fantastic job. And it's a great action movie. But then you verse it towards the first movie. It's so tight. It's logical with its unchanging timeline. It sticks to that narrative that the time is the time and you can't change it. It's already happened before. It's already been set. There's just one set time continuum. And if you travel back to 1984, it's because you've always been in 1984. That's the past. That's the way it always was. And so it sets that up. So, oh man, we're reaching the 2-hour mark here on this movie review. I love the Terminator franchise. So, I'm going to have to go with my number 2 being the original Terminator. What a fantastic movie. It's just that I like Terminator 2 Judgment Day just a little bit better. So T1 gets my silver medal. Not for any flaws in the movie of itself, because it's basically flawless, but just because I like the second movie better. It hits me on an emotional level. It excites me with the action. I think some of the humor does work. I know some people have criticized it for humor that doesn't work. To me, it kind of does. And so it has those comic relief moments in the action movie and the intensity of it. So Terminator 2 gets my gold. Terminator 1 gets my silver. So that's my ranking. Maybe someday I'll change my mind and like Terminator 1 better. I do love both of these two movies. They're both awesome. So it could go either way. All right. So that's my ranking, and that wraps up my review. We just went barely over 2 hours. So remember to like, share, subscribe. Man, if you made it through this 2-hour video, you must like my channel. So please give it a thumbs up. All right. God bless. Dragonfire out.